This week on Dangerous Tides, we're looking at another forgotten Laker that is the tale of heroism and tragedy all at once. Named for the great-grandfather of prominent American businessman and late Yankees owner George Steinbrenner, this vessel has had a long and eventful history of service on the Great Lakes, with many a mariner's superstition that she was doomed from the start, proven to be correct on the early morning of May 11th, 1953, when a sudden storm took the lives of 17 crewmen who served on board the aging ship that day. This spirit of heroism would carry on a legacy of camaraderie on the Great Lakes for years to come, which carries on today from the old salts of the Great Lakes to the young bucks making their career there. So climb aboard as we explore the SS Henry Steinbrenner on Dangerous Tides. The Henry Steinbrenner was built by the Jinx Shipbuilding Company in Port Huron, Michigan, to be operated by the Kinsman Transit Company of Cleveland, Ohio. The hull had been launched on September 28, 1901, with the workers forced to move ahead of schedule due to a fire breaking out near the slipway she was built on. Named for the head of the Kinsman Transit Company, the Steinbrenner was set to be a reflection of American business and trade across the Great Lakes. The Steinbrenner's legacy continued well into the annals of history to today, with many of them investing into different areas of business over the years, including the ownership of the New York Yankees. The Steinbrenner measured up to 427 feet in length, a beam of 50 feet, and a capacity of 6,500 tons. She was designed to be an ore carrier, much like the other freighters of her day, when steel was cheap enough to manufacture for the usage of shipping, among other feats of engineering. Other features of the Steinbrenner include cabins for the deck crew, captain's quarters, and a pilot house for daily operations. The rest of her crew would have their quarters set in the stern, along with the galley and the mess halls. These design specifications were standard for the freighters of the time. The cargo hold and interior of the ship was accessible through 12 telescoping hatch covers and was propelled by Scotch Marine boilers connected to a triple expansion steam engine. The top speed of the Steinbrenner would be measured up to 12 knots. The circumstances surrounding the freighter's launch caught up with her at the end of the 1909 season on December 6th. With a load of iron ore in the cargo hold, she collided on the St. Mary's River with another recently built vessel, the SS Harry A. Berwind. On Mud Lake at Round Island, the bow of the Berwind tore a 25-foot hole in her midship. The Steinbrenner rapidly filled with water before settling onto the bottom, with only her aft deck house and pilot house could be seen from the surface. Much to the fortune of the crew that day, all the crew survived, but the Henry Steinbrenner was sunk, with underwriters considering a total constructive loss. Under the command of salvager Tom Reed, the Steinbrenner would be raised and repaired before returning to the Kinsman Transit Company to continue her service on the lakes at a cost of $35,000. That is $1.18 million in today's money. Cutting a hole through the 12-inch thick ice that covered the lake at the end of the season, he sent his team of divers to patch the hole in the vessel. Once the ice thawed, the salvage team built a cofferdam to raise the deck to the surface and pump out the water within the hull. In 1923, the Steinbrenner would once again be involved with another collision. This one was not quite as serious as the encounter with the Berwind. Under heavy fog in Whitefish Bay, the SS John McCarthy Kennedy was struck by her bow. The damage to the Steinbrenner was minimal and only cost $5,000, while the John McCarthy Kennedy needed $150,000 in repairs. In October of 1941, the Steinbrenner would accidentally ram the Sioux Canal's lock wall, with significant damage to the hull. Once again, she would be repaired and returned to service. The next 12 years would be largely uneventful for the Steinbrenner, with 1953 marking over half a century of service on the lake. This made her the oldest vessel the Kinsman fleet had at their disposal, but it was not the oldest freighter on the lakes. Upon recertification on May 4th, 1953, the American Bureau of Shipping cleared her to operate after 5 years in dry dock for inspection. Despite confidence from officials, dock workers had raised concerns about her seaworthiness. The Steinbrenner was showing her age at the time she was cleared. Non-essential equipment was often broken or in need of repair, and she wasn't always a comfortable ship to work on. Some speculated the Mulholland clamps on the hatch covers were so old, some of the threads have stripped, leading to loose hatches. Lax maintenance, however, was a common occurrence on the lakes, but no one could anticipate that there were any serious issues when the Steinbrenner began the season. Captain Albert Stiglin was recently assigned to the Steinbrenner, having spent a majority of his 20-year career on the lakes with the Kinsman Transit. Before boarding the aging freighter, Stiglin served 4 years on the SS Philip Mensch and was respected by many of the crew members aboard the Steinbrenner, with both crews attesting to his navigational skills. On the morning of May 10th, 1953, meteorologists reported clear skies, with the temperature reaching the mid-70s. The SS Henry Steinbrenner was loaded with 6,800 tons of iron ore before leaving the Northern Railway dock in Superior, Wisconsin. At 5 a.m., Lake Superior was absolutely calm, with no signs of storms coming in. Stiglin would recall that it was smoother than a pond, and anticipating a routine trip to the Bethlehem steel mills over in Lake Erie. With the Steinbrenner beginning downbound, everything seemed to be going as planned. Steering and navigation equipment was checked and working properly, but the radar was out of commission. Still, Stiglin felt that the radar wouldn't be necessary on this day. All the hatches were closed and secured by the clamps, with the tarps stored away. Because battening down the hatches was a long and arduous process, the tarps were only secured if the captains anticipated poor conditions. So while there was a forecast calling for a change later in that day with 30 to 35 mile-an-hour winds and occasional squalls, it wasn't anything that had the potential to sink the Steinbrenner for the last time. Any sailor with a year or two's worth of experience would have experienced far worse on the lakes. Despite the morning being near perfect conditions for a routine haul, the weather would quickly go downhill. At 3 p.m., south to southwest winds began churning Lake Superior with building waves. An hour and a half later, the first waters washed over the western deck of the Steinbrenner. With conditions deteriorating fast, Captain Stiglin quickly realized he would be in for a rough night. He quickly sent a crew out to inspect the hatches while connected to a lifeline. Despite worsening conditions, everything seemed secured. A cold dinner would be served about 5 p.m. in the galley, as it was too rough to prepare anything else. Most of the deck crew couldn't even make it to the stern for the meal, given that the only way over was to cross the weather deck. By 8 p.m., Captain Stiglin was struggling to keep the Steinbrenner on course when a deck watch had approached with disturbing news. The number 11 hatch cover had gotten loose, flapping in the wind and letting huge swells of water into the cargo hold. In an attempt to stop the flooding, third mate George Wiseman and 3 other deckhands would secure themselves to a lifeline and carefully climbed down to hatch 11. The winds and the waves would knock them over multiple times, but they had reached the hatch and attempted repairs. Before they could start, a huge wave sent one man 15 feet into the cargo hold. Fortunately, the others managed to lift him back onto the deck and carried him onto the galley unscathed. The rest of the crew would go back and finally secure the hatch cover. By the time the repairs were finished, conditions were too violent for them to return to the bow, so they spent the rest of the night sheltering in the aft quarters. By the time they realized how oppressive the conditions were, it was too late to secure the tarps, having to rely on the bilge pumps to keep the water out of the hold. If another hatch broke, it would spell the end of the Steinbrenner. By 11 p.m., the Henry Steinbrenner was facing the full brunt of the storm, with 80-mile-an-hour winds and swells reaching to 30 to 35 feet. Captain Stiglin attempted to keep the waves focused on the bow, but as conditions worsened, waves were tossing the vessel left and right, flooding the weather deck from both sides. The engineering crew worked hard to maintain full steam, ensuring that Stiglin would have the power to fight the storm. Oiler Alan Osberger claimed the ship rolled so heavily, waves were sending water down the funnel. At midnight, the Steinbrenner reduced its speed to 4.8 miles an hour, keeping her steady as the crew prayed for a change in the storm with bated breath. The wind howled on, tearing away at the aging vessel, the hull creaking and moaning with every crashing wave. It felt like the longest night anyone had seen on board, and with each hour, it only seemed to deteriorate. At 4:30, the number 11 hatch would once again break loose. With conditions too violent to send anyone out to secure the hatch, Captain Stiglin had no other option but to rely on the pumps. With every roll, more water poured into the hatch. With the ship beginning to lose power, an hour and a half later, with the rudder slow to respond, on top of this, other hatch covers were coming loose. Captain Stiglin made a last-ditch effort to turn the ship around, so the aft deckhouse could provide enough cover for the crew members to recover the open hatches. But there was no relief. A wave crashed over the pilot house and ripped open a wooden door. The crew tried to brace the broken passage, but every wave would break it open again. The vessel was being torn apart. Upon realizing they were in dire straits, Captain Stiglin would make the first SOS call at 7 a.m., ordering the crew to don their life jackets. While he still held out hope to save his ship, he turned his attention to saving the lives of his crew. 6 vessels responded to his SOS call, including 2 of the largest vessels available at the time, the Wilfred Sykes and the Joseph H. Thompson. It was a race against time to save the distressed Steinbrenner. With water temperatures at 36 degrees, his crew would only have a small window of time before hypothermia sets in. In only half an hour, hatches 10, 11, and 12 had all broke wide open, with Lake Superior rushing into the ship. Stiglin knew he had to abandon ship, so he stopped all engines and sounded the general alarm. At 15 miles south of Isle Royale Light, he sent out a desperate mayday call, ordering the crew to abandon ship. Letting out 7 short blasts from the ship's whistle, followed by a long blast. The next few minutes would determine their fate. The Steinbrenner began to sink stern first, with Captain Stiglin and 9 other crew stationed around the bow near the life raft secured to the pilot house. The captain witnessed 2 other lifeboats making it off the ship, one with a proper launch at starboard, and the other managing to clear as the stern took a dive beneath Lake Superior. With confidence the rest of his crew made it out, Captain Stiglin joined the rest of the 9 crew members on the life raft, just as the bow made her last descent. A wave would soon sweep over them and flip the raft over. 6 men, including the captain, climbed back on board, but 4 disappeared into the lake. Meanwhile, on the lifeboats, one man was violently thrown into the sea from the starboard side before being recovered by his crewmates. 19-year-old Kenneth Coombe rushed onto the weather deck and tried to swim ashore, but a crewman stopped him, reminding him of the cold temperatures. As if luck would have it, a wave swept over him and carried him out to midship. He felt a blast of heat as the boilers exploded in the near-freezing water. When he finally resurfaced, he was only a few feet away from the portside lifeboat. He joined 21-year-old second cook Bernard Oberski and Frank Tomczak. The boat was almost completely flooded as they were battered constantly by the waves. They ran out of strength before too long, and they had all hope to survive. Kenneth was a large man, weighing in at 225 pounds, and had attributed that to his life being spared. Frank Bernard pulled him back on the boat, while survivors waited desperately, hoping the other vessels would hear their calls for help. 4 hours later, 6 ships would arrive to aid the surviving crew and captain. Conditions were rough, and low visibility made it difficult to find the lifeboats in the raft. Captain George Fisher of the SS Wilfred Sykes scanned the area for any signs of life, catching a glimpse of the half-flooded portside lifeboat pitching on the crest of a wave. The crew of the Wilfred Sykes deployed a Jacob's ladder for Kenneth Coombe to grab hold. The crew lifted the Jacob's ladder and the half-frozen man on board. Just as Kenneth made it on deck, a large wave swept the lifeboat further away. Captain Fisher pulled the ship in a tight circle to rejoin the remaining 2 men in the lifeboat. The Sykes' third mate, Arthur Ritter, and 2 volunteers lowered one of the Sykes lifeboats to retrieve the others. With the rescue successful, the crew went to work trying to warm up the freezing sailors. Frank Tomczak, unfortunately, succumbed to hypothermia. The Joseph A. Thompson would find the captain's life raft and successfully rescued the 6 men on board. Another ship, the resurrected D.M. Clemson, would find the other lifeboat after Captain A.M. Everett spotted the remaining crew. After some tricky maneuvering and a failed pass that almost sent the lifeboat into the propeller, he positioned his vessel to provide some leeway and brought the 7 remaining men on board. They were rushed to the captain's cabin, given warm baths, hot breakfasts, and dry clothes. For both lifeboats and the raft, the rescue came in the nick of time. Another half hour, and more lives would have been lost. In total, 17 men went down with the Henry Steinbrenner. Once the survivors were brought to shore, attention shifted as to what caused the sinking. The Coast Guard immediately began taking interviews of the survivors, with many criticizing the state of the 52-year-old ship, with complaints that she wasn't seaworthy. The strip clamps were pointed out to investigators, along with added scrutiny towards past collisions and incidents. On May 18th, the Marine Board of Investigations wrapped up their inquiry, concluding that despite the age and the crew's concerns, the Steinbrenner was appropriately seaworthy by the time she went down. This was further supported by inspections carried out on the ship and testimony from other crew members, including Kenneth Coombe, who claimed the clamps were in fine condition and the hatch covers were watertight when they were secured. The board surmised that the cause of the failure of the number 10, 11, and 12 hatches that came loose in heavy seas caused flooding that the ship would not survive. The loss would be blamed on adverse weather conditions, some deeming it an act of God. The board determined that Captain Stiglin was not at fault for neglecting to batten down the hatches before disembarking, as any reasonable captain would have made the same decision. The Commandant of the Coast Guard, however, strongly disagreed with the board's conclusions, pointing out that Captain Stiglin went against regulations at the time, stating that exposed cargo hatches needed to be secure before leaving port. Captain Stiglin would be stripped of his master's license for failing to take this step, but no other discipline was handed out. The loss of the Steinbrenner soon faded from memory with little learned. Over a decade later, one of the survivors of the Steinbrenner, Norm Bragg, found himself on another aging freighter, the Daniel J. Morrell, caught in an excruciating storm in Lake Huron. As the Morrell went down, Norm gave advice to the crew members on how to survive. Before he went down with the Morrell, his last words were, "It's been good to know you." This episode is dedicated to the hard work of the maritime researcher, archaeologists, and shipwreck historical societies in taking the time to gather these stories, as well as the memory of those lost on the Henry Steinbrenner. If you liked what you heard tonight, please give us a like and consider subscribing. And may the fair winds guide you through dangerous tides.